So this last section of lecture for this week talks about chemical agents. So the cellular targets of physical and chemical agents include the cell wall, cell membrane, cellular synthetic processes, so DNA, RNA, and then proteins. Different compounds have a different effect on different parts of the cell. These particular targets are the same type of targets that are going to be targeted by antibiotics. So we'll talk about each of these targets in a little more detail when we get to antibiotics. So what level of microbicidal chemical do we need? Well, there's high level, intermediate level, and low level germicides. High level germicides kill endospores, and they're sterilants if properly used. Critical items that are not heat sterilizable, like items that are going to go into the body, such as catheters or heart and lung equipment, those would require high-level germicides. These are expensive and they're toxic, so you have to be careful while using them. But if you don't treat catheters, for example, with these, then there's no way to really sterilize them. Intermediate-level germicides kill fungal but not bacterial spores, resistant pathogens such as the tubercle bacillus, so Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and viruses. They're used to disinfect semi-critical items like respiratory equipment, thermometers. So respiratory equipment is considered semi-critical because the respiratory tract already has a lot of natural biota inside of it. So a lot of natural bacteria is already inside of the respiratory tract. So respiratory equipment is usually considered semi-critical. And then low-level germicides eliminate only vegetative bacteria. Vegetative means that they're living, breathing, moving, ions are being exchanged, they're doing their normal life function. Vegetative fungal cells, and then some viruses. They're used to clean non-critical materials like electrodes, straps, furniture that touches the skin but not mucous membranes, things that patients would touch in a hospital setting. So this is a list of some of the chemical agents in microbial control, and then the level of activity, whether they're toxic or not, and then any other comments. So you can read through this list and see if you recognize any of the terms that are on this list. So all of these chemical categories you won't necessarily be tested on. There may be a couple that you might find on a quiz, but they won't be on an exam. So I'm just going to go through these briefly. So the halogens, fluorine, bromine, chlorine, and iodine can all be used as disinfectants. So chlorine, that's what we put in pool water. Chlorine does not kill Cryptosporidium, so if there is a fecal accident of somebody that is infected with crypto in a pool, like a public pool, everybody that has pool water that day can get infected with Cryptosporidium. So it does a really good job though. And then when we talk about hot tubs are hot, which means that a lot of chemicals that are inside of the water evaporate at a much faster rate than, for example, like a colder pool. So because they have a hot temperature, the chemicals continuously evaporate out of the water, so the chemicals don't do a great job at disinfecting pool water. So if you do have a hot tub at home, there's something that you have to be careful with called hot tub rash, and that's caused by Pseudomonas aeruginosa. If you lift up the cover of the hot tub and there's a film of growth on the top of the hot tub or on the underside of the cover, you know that it's likely infected with that type of bacteria, and you have to retreat with chlorine before entering into the water. Failure to do so can result in an inflamed, crazy burning rash all over the body, known as hot tub rash. And that is very difficult to treat, even with antibiotic treatment, because P. aeruginosa has this thick capsule that it forms on the outer layer of its cell, and that makes it resistant to a lot of different types of antibiotics. But anyways, so that's just a little bit about chlorine. Chlorine is also found in bleach, and bleach is an excellent disinfectant, especially if you have a mold issue in the house. Spraying bleach on a mold will kill it. Now molds tend to come back and they tend to deposit spores and leave spores behind, and then they can grow. So if you do have a mold issue in the house, I recommend spraying bleach once a week for the first month, and then once a month for the next 2 months, and then that should completely get rid of the mold issue. Now, iodine. Iodine is a topical antiseptic, and it's also a disinfectant. I'll tell you a little story about iodine and one of my dogs in Texas. So while I was getting my master's degree, I lived down in Texas in a ranch on a 40-acre farm with all these different animals and everything. We had like 8 outdoor dogs. And down there, your dogs kind of just run free and do whatever, and they come back for feeding times, and that was the life that I lived down in Texas. So one morning, I came out looking for my dogs, and I looked all around, and I couldn't find one particular dog. And I called him Squiggle Sam. He was like some type of pointer dog, and he had a curly tail, and he had black and white spots, like large spots all over him, and it's a really good dog. But he was missing, and he was the pup of the dog that I called Mama Dog. You know, the names that I came up with weren't that clever. But anyway, so I asked him, like, Mama Doggy, where's Sam? So she like took me to this trailer area, and I looked underneath the trailer and found Sam, my Squiggle Sam. So I pulled him out, and I looked at his back leg, and his back leg looked like he had gotten run over by a car, which down there, that was pretty likely. I mean, there's such a dog overpopulation problem. Dogs are usually seen as roadkill, and people run them over and hit them all the time and don't even think twice about it. So, feeling bad for my dog, I picked him up and brought him in the house and started scrubbing away at his leg, and all of a sudden all of the flesh on his leg started basically melting away. So when I noticed that, I knew at that point that this was rattlesnake venom, that he had gotten bitten by a rattlesnake. And rattlesnakes were all over the outside. I mean, I lived on a ranch in the middle of nowhere in southern Texas. Rattlesnakes are everywhere. And what rattlesnake venom does is it has collagenases inside of it that eat through and digest collagen. So all of the flesh of my dog's leg was just falling off, and it was really horrible. The kind of plus thing is that they don't feel pain when this is happening. So the flesh, it looks really terrible, but they aren't in a tremendous amount of pain. The danger is when that enzyme gets into the bloodstream. But fortunately, because of the location of the bite, it didn't get into my dog's bloodstream. So my dog lived, and he was okay. Well, back then I was going to a private Catholic university for my master's degree, super broke, couldn't afford veterinary care. So I ended up just treating the wound myself. And at home, I had this bottle of iodine. So after like kind of controlling some of the wound in the bathtub, as soon as I found him, I sprayed it with iodine and wrapped up the leg. And every morning and every night, I would unwrap it, douse it with iodine, rewrap it. And I repeated this, and eventually the entire wound closed up and healed up. I thought I would have had to amputate his leg. I was like, we are going to have to take him to the vet, and he's going to lose his leg. But surprisingly, the iodine prevented infection and promoted wound healing. So iodine is a major component of the thyroid hormone, and thyroid hormone does a lot with metabolism and helping with energy production and all that type of stuff. So I really feel like this iodine not only had this role in preventing infection, but also boosting the production of the thyroid hormone, which eventually led to wound healing, and my dog's leg got saved. So it was pretty amazing. So iodine, it's an incredible compound. Phenol and its derivatives. So high concentrations are cellular poisons, but low concentrations, they inactivate certain critical enzyme systems. By bisphenol and triclosan. Triclosan is something that we put in a lot of different soaps. They used to call the soaps antibacterial hand soaps, but now they had to change all the labeling. So you will very rarely find a soap label that says antibacterial. It may beat around the bush and say something like, oh, well, it decreases bacteria numbers, or it washes away bacteria, but it can't necessarily say antibacterial anymore, because saying antibacterial implies that it's killing bacteria. And there's a lot of bacteria that are resistant to these compounds now, even in nature, so we can't say antibacterial so much anymore. Chlorhexidine. So chlorhexidine is used for preparing skin for surgery and obstetric antiseptic. Alcohols, so our spray bottles that we use in lab to disinfect the countertops, that's 70% ethanol, so that's an alcohol. Only ethyl and isopropyl alcohols are suitable for microbial control. Other types of alcohols can be toxic, and we don't want those toxic alcohols around us. More effective in inactivating enveloped viruses than non-enveloped viruses. Another thing about alcohol is the reason why we use 70% instead of using like 100% ethanol is because at a higher percentage of ethanol, it would evaporate too quickly. So as soon as it hit the surface, it would evaporate away before it had a chance to actually kill anything. So we reduce the concentration so that it doesn't evaporate that quickly, and it's allowed to stay on the surface for a longer period of time to actually do its job. Hydrogen peroxide. We talked a lot about hydrogen peroxide. So their germicidal effects are due to the direct and indirect actions of oxygen. So oxygen forms hydroxyl free radicals, which are highly toxic and reactive to cells. They can be harmful to tissue. I had a colleague at a previous university that I worked for. She got 6% hydrogen peroxide. Now, standard hydrogen peroxide at the store is 3%, so this was double in concentration. And she spilt it all over her hands because she thought it was just regular old hydrogen peroxide. Now, spilling this on her hands caused a chemical reaction, and her hands turned bright white and her skin started peeling off, and it looked so awful, and she was like screaming in pain. It was terrible, and hydrogen peroxide can definitely damage tissue, so you have to make sure you're dealing with the appropriate concentration. Surfactants. So surfactants are chemicals that interrupt cell membrane function. They act as detergents. Soaps are weak microbicides but gain germicidal value when mixed with agents such as chlorhexidine or iodine. Heavy metals. So mercury, gold, or silver, gold, copper, arsenic, zinc. They've all been used as germicides. Silver has been added to certain types of antibiotics to increase the effectivity of the antibiotic. The drawbacks are heavy metals are very toxic to people, so you can only tolerate them in low doses. Also, a lot of people have some allergic reactions to these different types of heavy metals. Sometimes these metals can be put in joint replacements, and then people have the bad allergic reaction to the joint, and their joint has to be replaced with a different type of metal. Large quantities of biological fluids and wastes neutralize their actions. Microbes can develop resistance to them. Gas sterilants, so ethylene oxide and propylene oxide are the two most common, and they are sterilant or sterilizing gases that are highly toxic to people if inhaled. Dyes. So this is why surgical scrub has a particular color to it. Usually it's like a yellow or orange color. So dyes kill microorganisms, particularly gram-positive species. And on the surface of your skin is a lot of gram-positive staphylococcus. So if you go to have surgery, like let's say you're having a cesarean section delivery of your baby, they use a surgical scrub that has a dye in it, and that's going to decrease the amount of natural bacteria that's on the surface of your skin. So when they cut you open and then stitch you back up, whatever bacteria was present was hopefully killed off by the dyes that were added to the surgical scrub. And then after, while you're healing, hopefully the microbial numbers stay low enough so that you don't reinfect the wound. Acids and bases can be added, and they do a good job at decreasing microbial growth. However, they are caustic and corrosive, so that's dangerous. Then triclosan. So triclosan I mentioned previously, but something about triclosan, it's excreted in the urine of about 75% of Americans. Be interesting to see where that statistic came from, or how they collected the urine samples from 75% of people in the United States. But anyways, there are detectable levels in groundwater sources, which means that animals are coming in contact with this. Any animals or wildlife that live in a natural body of water that come in contact with this now have that exposure. And then bacteria in the environment. So after water is treated in a water treatment plant, the safe water is dumped directly back into a water source, so a natural body of water. And if this is present, the bacteria that's in that water gets exposed to this. Creates dioxin-like compounds when exposed to light, and promotes resistance to triclosan and other antibiotics. So this is a bad thing that we're just dumping all this stuff and it's just passing out of our bodies through our urinary system. So this is a list of some active ingredients of various commercial products, and you can see what has triclosan in it. So Ajax, Dawn antibacterial hand soap, Dial antibacterial hand soap, Colgate toothpaste, Noxema triple clean. So those types of compounds could cause that to come out of our urinary system. So that's just a brief overview of some of the chemicals and physical methods to control microbial growth. Next week, we'll be talking about all of the different types of antibiotics.